Hi, I'm Mark Brumley, president of Ignatius Press. I'm here with Father Joseph Fessio, the editor and founder of Ignatius Press, Vivian Dudreau, one of our senior editors, a thoughtful Catholic woman and former commune dweller, that'll come up in due course, and John Harriet from our marketing department. He's an artist, cover designer, and he also oversees our ipnovels.com site. And our subject today is Laudato Si, which is Pope Francis's second encyclical on the environment. Or is it? We'll see. I'd like to begin by turning to the founding father of Ignatius Press, himself a Jesuit and a farmer, to talk about this encyclical and to start us off by giving us an overview.
Thank you, Mark. And we would like to have a general overview of the encyclical, some of the main themes, and go into the details. And I believe this encyclical will be a good subject of discussion for a long time to come. There's a lot in there. It's very well organized. If we look at it, there's an introduction in which Pope Francis refers to previous popes, to Paul VI, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, to show that what he's saying here is not totally new. The Church has already spoken in many ways on this environmental issue. Then, in the first chapter, which is called What is Happening to Our Common Home, basically describes some of the problems that everybody's aware of, and there's some scientific discussion about what some of these problems are, what the extent of them is. But he sets the scene for the degradation of the environment that we see and that we're more conscious of these days. And in the second chapter, called The Gospel of Creation, he looks at the scriptural basis for the Christian and Catholic view of the environment, from Genesis all the way through the New Testament. So there he's setting forth some general principles that will be applied in the rest of this document. Chapter 3 is called The Human Roots of the Ecological Crisis, and here he's saying it's not enough to look at the crisis itself or the symptoms, what's actually happening. What are the root causes? And the root causes are in the heart of man, and our idea of man, and our idea of what culture is, and what progress is, and what technology does. So here he's really getting into the underlying foundational elements which then manifest themselves in our society in environmental difficulties. Chapter 4 is called Integral Ecology, and here's one of the, I think, central and beautiful parts of this document, that it's not just a question of the oceans or the land or the air. It's society, it's culture, it's a whole human complexus. And it's kind of a Catholic approach, an integrated approach. We can't just look at one aspect. Especially, he'll say, we can't look at technological solutions as the only way of solving these problems. It's a human heart. Then, after he's outlined what that integral ecology might look like, chapter 5 speaks of the lines of approach and action. What are practical things that can be done? More importantly, I think, is chapter 6, where he says not only is it important to do these things, we have to change our attitudes, we have to change our heart, we have to educate ourselves to respect God's gift of creation, to make it available for future generations and so on. So that's the basic outline of the encyclical.
And I'm going to ask a question, and anybody can jump in on this. I sort of anticipated the question in my introduction. To what extent is this an encyclical on the environment? Do you think that's a fair description of it, or is there a problem with that?
If you consider the environment, everything that surrounds us, including other human beings and structures, then I think it is. If you consider the environment just to be air, soil, and water, well then no, it's not on that at all.
Okay. Well, I think that Pope Benedict, in one of his books, mentions that the environment, speaking of the environment, doesn't really encompass what we're truly talking about, and he says he prefers the word creation. Mm-hmm. So I would say it's more of an encyclical on creation.
Vivian, what do you think about that?
That's a good point, yeah.
I would add to that that it's an encyclical on man's relationship to creation and ultimately to the Creator who made creation and gave it to us as a gift. And that relationship with creation encompasses everything, his relationship to other human beings, his relationship to other creatures, and his relationship to God.
A couple weeks ago, I put on my Facebook page an article that was anticipating this encyclical, and it was amazing to me how heated the conversation got. Now, this is before the encyclical is even out. I think it would be fair to say people had some sense of what was going to be in it based on things the Holy Father himself had said, based on things that Cardinal Turkson had said about the encyclical. So it wasn't completely as if people were opining about a document they had no idea what was there. But it generated a lot of conversation. Is there anything in this document, you've all three read it, that surprised you?
No.
Okay. Pretty much, he said...
Knowing the Holy Father and how he expresses himself, knowing his concerns, his interests, and also knowing that this issue is something which is not a new issue. I mean, it's at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. So I don't think any specific thing surprised me. It might have been kind of a pleasant surprise that it was so holistic.
Yes.
And so well organized, and really focused on our having to change our view of what human life is and human happiness and human fulfillment. That's very strong in this encyclical. So that it's surprised in a sense that I wasn't exactly expecting it, but after I see it, it's not surprising in itself, I don't think.
Right. Some people are just surprised that he would address the topic. I know there was a lot of consternation. John sees my Facebook page sometimes, so he knows, he's probably aware. A lot of people posting, well, why is he talking about this? There's so many other things he could talk about. You know, that he's chosen this as the topic of his second encyclical, you know, that was a shock to some people, and it was an annoyance, or even going beyond being annoyed. Do you have any thoughts on that? This is an appropriate topic for an encyclical?
Well, I think that part of that is people's perception of who Pope Francis is versus who some of our previous popes, like Pope Benedict, are. And to a large extent, the media pretty much ignored the fact that Pope Benedict spoke out a lot on this topic. It's a very large amount of his writings reference this stuff, which is why it gets referenced so repeatedly in this encyclical. Pope Benedict is repeatedly referenced. So
he was sometimes called the Green Pope.
Yeah, by some, and so it's not surprising, I guess, in one sense, that the media who have formed their own picture of who Pope Francis is and who previous popes are, have decided to latch on to the idea that this is something completely new and completely different, and is going to be revolutionary in a way that almost changes the way the Church teaches, rather than being what it is, which is a reiteration of Church teaching, applying it to the current situation, which is what encyclicals are intended to do.
Now, you mentioned this term church teaching. A lot of people say, well, it's great for the Pope to give church teaching, to talk about how to get to heaven, about sins and about redemption and mercy. We've got a whole year of mercy that's coming up. But this is political, this is economic, this is scientific. How is this appropriate as a subject matter for the Pope when he's supposed to be giving us church teaching?
Well, he approaches this topic as a pastor. I would say that this pontificate is marked by a very pastoral approach to human problems. And so what surprised me, I was surprised that his pastoral approach comes out so strongly. I think I was expecting more political, economic, and so forth, kind of gobbledygook or Vatican boilerplate or some of this. And I was really struck and moved even by the profound understanding he has for the human condition, and how he sees our ecological problems as symptomatic, really, of a larger problem. And so he's dealing, it's not just a ruse. He wants to talk about the environment because it's trendy to talk about the environment. I think he's talking about the environment because it is a subject of serious consideration. But he sees it in this bigger picture of the human person and what's going to bring us ultimate fulfillment, and our destruction of the environment is symptomatic of the problem of sin.
And the key answer, the key concept seems to answer both those questions. Why did he write it, and is this church teaching, is the poor. Because he has a great love for and concern with the poor. And remember, he grew up in Argentina and spent time in the barrios and so on, the favelas. And so he sees the degradation of the environment in big cities, and also the resources being drawn by the industrialized countries for their good, with the harmful effects sometimes going on the poor. So because of his love for the poor, he wants to write about the environment, and his teaching is related to theology, to doctrine, insofar as we have a obligation to the poorest and the weakest, which is why he also mentions the unborn in here and the elderly. So it's a global view that we have to help those who are most in need.
Talk about that a little bit, especially with respect to the unborn, because he's got an interesting passage where he talks about, I'm paraphrasing, but we are rightly concerned about the extinction of species and things of that sort. But that concern that drives some people needs to be extended to the unborn, to the human embryo.
I think you said enough.
Well, but I mean, I think that, yeah, but that we don't always see that. We often hear people on the pro-life side of things, we're chided because supposedly we're inconsistent. Of course, there are pro-lifers who aren't consistent. All right, we'll acknowledge that we have human failings like anybody else. But you rarely hear the charge on the other side. Well, if you really love all life, why aren't you pro-life?
Right, and that, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, that gets to the heart of one of the things he is insistent about, and that is this utilitarian view of creation. If our starting point is that these things are here for us to use according to our own wills, then of course we're going to exploit and use, and that's going to fall the hardest on the weakest and most vulnerable members of the human family. And so this challenge that he's putting forth applies to everyone. Do we look at creation as a gift that we're supposed to be grateful for, first of all, and then conducting our lives in harmony with it and in harmony of the laws of nature, which are the laws of God, according to Thomas Jefferson, then you're going to look at this is a human being, not just a product of use.
One of the propositions in philosophy, and Immanuel Kant is famous for this, that you should never use people as a mere means, but always as an end. And he talks about that, and there's a danger that when we get in the habit of using, we wind up using not just things, but people, and using people as things. But he also makes a distinction about how things are used.
Right.
Here. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Even things shouldn't be used as mere means. That everything, as a creature of God, has its own inherent goodness, and it has to be respected. So it's true that animals have no rights, but animals have intrinsic good, and therefore we can't just use them or dominate them because we feel like it arbitrarily. He's clear on that many times.
There's an appropriate way of responding to the good that an animal is, or that the natural resources of the planet represent, and there are inappropriate ways. Right?
And they have a given nature.
Oh, that's an interesting term.
So
Come back to that.
Yeah, so to use an animal as if it were an inanimate object is denying its nature and a misuse of an animal. And to use a human being as if it were just an object or just another animal on the same order, everything has an intrinsic nature that's already been given to it. And we have to come to the table respecting this, or we're going to misuse
Let's
things.
expand on that a bit, because that's throughout the document, and it brings in a whole lot of other issues. But at the heart of it, he's saying, is just the technological paradigm that what's out there is not nature, it's just matter for us to manipulate for our own benefit, whatever it is, including our own bodies. And he mentions that there too.
He does.
So, we have to listen to nature, respect nature, and do things to nature which help us. That's what economy and commerce does. we have to enrich and enhance nature, but in accordance with its own intrinsic laws and not in some pure arbitrary imposition of our will. It's kind of, what he's criticizing here in a larger perspective is that the dominance of will over intellect, that our will can determine what we do with this plastic matter in front of us instead of looking at things themselves. And he applies it to our femininity and our masculinity.
Mm-hmm. Right.
We have to accept that as part of nature too.
Some people are going to be surprised that you're going to have some people read this and be all for the conversation about the natural world and the environment and respecting it and all of that. And probably a lot of people will sign on board for we need to be aware of how this affects the third world and developing nations and so on. But then he broadens it under that rubric you mentioned when he talks about integral ecology. He broadens it to talk about cultural ecology and so on, and even the nature of gender and the relationship of men and women.
And so here's what's interesting to me about this, is that generally you think of the Catholic Church as very conservative, and the Greens and tech society is very liberal and for progress, But in fact, the idea of preserving nature and sustainable, that's very conservative. And so what the Pope has done here is to kind of unite Catholic conservatism with apparent liberalism on the part of the ambient culture to say, we all are considered for our own. Don't we all want to preserve the beauty, the goodness that's there and pass it on to others? So I think that's pretty brilliant there. But it's not, Francis is intelligent. I don't think he's intelligent as either of his predecessors, but he's very intelligent. But the point is, his brilliance is not necessarily Francis, it's the Church's brilliance. He's giving expression here to the Church's view of the harmony of all these things,
You know what it reminded me a lot of, Father, is Wendell Berry. In his essay on two economies, he describes what he calls the great economy, which he says can only be described in religious terms and understood through a religious mind, and the human economy, which is dependent upon the great economy. And as soon as we think of it only as the human economy, where we are giving value to things rather than taking things from nature and increasing their value and stewarding them, then we start to, break things apart, and our understanding of ourselves in relation to the world starts to break up.
That's a very good point. I think if there's one thing that surprised me is I didn't see the word economy used in its theological sense in the way I would have thought of, and that the sort of rubric under which this encyclical is being presented, this expression on care for our common home. I was thinking of economics, economy of salvation, all that. The ideas were there, but the term wasn't used in that way, and it's good that you bring that up. The Wendell Berry point about the two economies, I think that's very good.
But that's the beautiful thing. Economy comes from the Greek word oikos, which means home. And he's taking us away from the mere technical, calculable, metric view of economics to the fact, hey, wait a minute, it's about a home, isn't it?
That's right.
The human part of it. So he's trying to humanize economics, basically, make economics really the study of the home.
Right, and and of course and this is your undergraduate degree, so we'll go back to that. But there is a tendency to see economics as primarily a scientific endeavor, and there's the whole science of economics, and not the sort of the older sense of economics as a dimension of the moral life that has to do with the home and the good of the home. So thinking very largely about our planet as a place we live, our home, obviously we're going to think about the ecology in economic terms in that older sense. Did you want to say something about that, Vivian?
Well, yes, because the economics as it's studied and applied currently, modern economics, is ruptured from moral ethics or morality, which originally was a subset of. And even Adam Smith was a moral philosopher.
Moral philosopher, that's right.
And now economics is mostly just a mathematical study of productivity and efficiency and all these things. And what's so bizarre is that this has now been given this preeminence of, when we're trying to decide whether to do X, Y, or Z, preeminence is always given to these quantities,
Right.
mathematical quantities, and these human questions of, well, what's the impact on this community? What's the impact on the environment? Well, where does that figure in these tables of numbers for the bottom line? So he's now, yes, calling back economics to its better self. And also he's demonstrating that this form of economics cannot substitute for political order. And that kind of, you want to talk about conservatives, I mean, we've seen in our own political debates in America this idea of conservatism somehow being united with this economic view that economics runs the show and
Right.
politics.
It's the economy, stupid. That was the
yes,
line.
yes. And so, wait, no. Economics can't substitute for political order. Political order meaning the ordering of our lives based on proper principles.
How do we live together?
And economics is taken into consideration, but it's not some magic law that governs the universe rightly.
And he says that almost specific like that, and he includes finance in that too.
Yes, he does.
We can't have the whole run by speculative finance, By the way, I just had this thought, which would be good for the end of the show. We're not going to end yet, but what's happened here is the church is not just black and white like I am. It's also green like I am.
I wore this on
And
purpose.
gray, is there a little gray in it?
Little
like John?
gray areas, yeah.
One of the other things I found really interesting in here is he talks about how our ecological awareness can come in the family, in the way that people are taught.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, given that I grew up in a family with 8 children, and my wife is from a family with 11, and we just sort of intuitively always use less. We always
There was less.
we always conserve. Always our first go-to thing is, can we get this secondhand? Can we reuse something? And it's goes back to what Chesterton called the romance of thrift, where it is more interesting and creative to find ways to reuse and to than it is to just, I have the money, I have the power, I have the will to go obtain something and do this or that. And it's not something that we are explicitly taught. It's just the way we grew up.
Right, something you caught growing up.
So, these people routinely fault overpopulation or large families for somehow destroying things. But, having grown up in that environment, I would say that we use less than many of the people we know who say that they're more ecologically sensitive.
Well, that's the irony. Your per capita consumption is way lower than perhaps a person living alone. If you go into the supermarkets in San Francisco, you see all these individualized portions and so on. Well, look at all the packaging and look at all the, and here you and a family, you probably cook from scratch. I know you grow your own vegetables, you brew your own beer. I mean, this simplicity, this creativity and everything is actually, as you say, cultivated in a larger family, and less of this just mindless consumption of sometimes smaller families.
There's a point here that relates to the encyclical, not just generally and philosophically, but on this issue of population and population control. Let's talk a little bit about what the Holy Father says about that, because I think it surprises some people who are thinking in terms of a certain understanding of environmentalism, and they assume that to be supportive of trying to appreciate creation and the environment, you're going to be militantly pro-population control.
Well, what did he say about that, Mark?
Well, I didn't
Tell
ask
us.
you.
And I'm not Irish, but I'll ask you the question too. No.
Well, what's interesting to me is when I read that, I realized that I'd read it somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And I came across the other quote, which was actually Malcolm Muggeridge, who says almost exactly what the Pope says, which he says that now we who are sated, who have to adopt the most extravagant and ridiculous devices to consume what we produce, while watching whole vast populations getting hungrier and hungrier, overcome our feelings of guilt by persuading ourselves that others are too numerous and have too many children. They ask for bread and we give them contraceptives.
That's well said.
So it's almost exactly what the Pope says in this encyclical, that we outsource our bad feelings about our own consumption by telling others to not breed so much.
That's right. That's right.
More than one occasion he says the solution is not getting rid of people, but rather changing the hearts of people and living a more sober lifestyle. You know?
Which also brought to mind our author, now late, Father Dubé, in his book, Happy Are You Poor. If you read that, it's very striking that what he's saying is very, very similar to what the Pope is recommending in this encyclical for people to live simpler lifestyles, to embrace evangelical poverty. I don't know if he uses that exact word here, but Father Dubé does. And he says that overall this will make you happier, which is also what Father Dubé's point is, happy are you poor. I think, to use a little bit of marketing here, people who are interested in living out this encyclical should really look into getting that book.
Right,
Okay,
right.
good.
Well, and I suspect that both Father Dubé and Pope Francis got it from Jesus. I think that's probably the common source there. You mentioned, speaking of sources, you mentioned Chesterton. Many of our viewers won't know the link between Pope Francis and G.K. Chesterton, but there is one. Tell us a little bit about that, John.
Well, he is an honorary member of the Argentinian Chesterton Society, and he's spoken at their conferences before. So we can surmise that he's, well informed on Chesterton's thought, and some of it may be creeping into what he's talking about here in this encyclical.
Well, he quotes small is beautiful. I mean, not the book, but that phrase in the encyclical.
That term, right.
And that's a very Chestertonian distributist concept. I mean, Chesterton was once giving a talk about this in New York, at some hotel, and someone in the audience said, well, Mr. Chesterton, what do you think would be the proper size for a country? He says, well, I think this hotel be about right, And many times in the encyclical, he's talking about fostering smaller businesses, smaller farm operations, diversification, not monoculture crops, but diversity of crops. The beauty of having a lot of small entrepreneurs and people with economic freedom as opposed to having it all aggregated into these large multinational corporations.
And the phrase small is beautiful is from the title of the book by E.F. Schumacher, who was himself influenced by Chesterton and distributism, which was a whole economic worldview that developed in the early part of the 20th century that emphasized that, the value of small businesses and things of that sort.
And what's interesting is he, I think, called it the Buddhist approach to the economy because he thought that if he referred to it as a Catholic approach to the economy, people wouldn't listen to him, although he privately said this was a Catholic approach.
That's right, that's right. He wrote that at a time when there was this Western fascination with things from the East, so he talked about this deeply rooted Western idea in the language of the East, thinking that people will find it more palatable. And it was very brilliant in that regard.
That section, I think it's number 129 in the encyclical, where he talks about what Father was saying, promoting an economy which favors productive diversity and business creativity. For example, there's a great variety of small-scale food production systems. Do you know of any in the...
That's right. We're not familiar with that, are we?
Your backyard is one.
Yeah.
We have the Ignatius Press vineyard we've planted and some special intensely grown apples and pears called super spindle method. I'm sure we'll have some pictures of that maybe on,
in connection with this video, right?
With the video, yeah. We're maybe about halfway through, a little bit more. I'd like to read just 2 short paragraphs, which I think are summary paragraphs, and let's make sure we've covered all these things. So in paragraph 16, which is part of his introduction, he says, although each chapter will have its own subject and specific approach, it will also take up and re-examine important questions previously dealt with. This is particularly the case with a number of themes which will reappear as the encyclical unfolds. So here are the themes. As examples, I'll point to the intimate relationship between the poor and the fragility of the planet, the conviction that everything in the world is connected, the critique of the new paradigms and forms of power derived from technology, the call to seek other ways of understanding the economy and progress, the value proper to each creature, the human meaning of ecology, the need for forthright and honest debate. We haven't talked about that, but he's not saying this in this, you got to accept everything I say here. Right. He's saying we need debate on this from all sides, science, but philosophy, theology, religion, and so on. the serious responsibility of international and local policy, the throwaway culture, and the proposal of a new lifestyle. These questions will not be dealt with once and for all, but reframed and enriched again and again. And then, more briefly, in paragraph 111, this has to do with the responses to these things. Ecological culture cannot be reduced to a series of urgent and partial responses to the immediate problems of pollution, environmental decay, and the depletion of material and natural resources. There needs to be a distinctive way of looking at things, a way of thinking, policies, an educational program, a lifestyle, and a spirituality which together generate resistance to the assault of the technocratic paradigm. Otherwise, even the best ecological initiatives can find themselves caught up in the same globalized logic of the technological paradigm. To seek only a technical remedy to each environmental problem which comes up is to separate what is in reality interconnected and to mask the true and deepest problems of the global system. So, have we covered most of those things in this?
We've certainly touched on some. On that latter quote there, you know, I envision a world in which we flip a switch tomorrow and the issues of impact on the environment and scarcity disappear, but we're still the same people. So we haven't dealt with that issue. That seems to be what he's getting at.
Right, but there's no switch. He's saying also
There is no switch.
There's no
right.
switch we can flip
Right.
like that.
But even if we could, we'd still have that problem.
And if we just try looking for it and trying to invent
right.
a better switch,
We're gonna
Yeah.
we're creating this. We're furthering the conditions that create the problem to begin with.
we're caught up in the same globalized logic, as he says.
That's
yeah.
right. So, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so the policy wonks who are expecting that this is going to give them a green light and a blueprint to just create more international bodies and more consolidated power, even though the Pope addresses the need for international cooperation. You know, you read a paragraph like that and you realize that he's talking about something wider and deeper than just more government at higher and higher levels is going to solve this.
But there is that kind of a background noise in this encyclical of global government, master planning.
Right.
There's a little bit of an echo of that in there, which I think kind of disturbs the still waters of what you just mentioned.
It does, it's there, and you're right. It also was in Benedict's.
Well, he quotes Benedict on that one.
Exactly, exactly.
He quotes the worst parts of Benedict on that one.
When he quotes Benedict, but I think there's enough in here to counterbalance
Yeah, I agree.
any idea that somehow some new world global order
Is going to
solve this problem, especially when any new such thing is going to be the same doggone thing we have right now. And he realizes that the structures of finance, the multinational corporations, the concentration of wealth and power, you know, I think he's sensitive to this reality and isn't putting a misplaced trust, you know, in the higher human realms to fix all of this for us.
Oh, sorry, go ahead,
Well,
John.
one of the books I just read recently by the late Stratford Caldecott, which is a book called Not As the World Gives, The Way of Creative Justice, which is inspired partly by Pope Francis. He had this really, I think, good paragraph in the, I think it's from the introduction, where he says, Catholics sometimes talk of Catholic social teaching, CST. There's a danger of treating this as a kind of ideology, a system of ideas, as though we're gleaning from the Church a body of advice to be applied to the secular world. The Church's teaching becomes functionalized, and the secular world is treated as primary. We can prevent this not only by avoiding the acronym, but by refusing to separate the subject itself from ethics, spirituality, and the creation of culture. And I thought it's interesting in this encyclical, the Pope also says this, we should not allow this to become activism, I think is how he puts it. And he also mentions the importance of the creation of culture, the appreciation of beauty, and all of these things as fostering an overall conversion of heart that can lead us to a greater ecological understanding of the world around us.
Certainly truth, goodness, and beauty are intertwined in how he expresses things here. I'm not always sure that people in the world see that. at least I think they're somewhat aware of it. But one of the things I find fascinating about the environmental movement is that sometimes people will talk about the sort of they will invest in their appreciation of the natural world. They will invest it with a moral significance, and that can kind of come across as indulgent. I love the beautiful landscape, and therefore you shouldn't be allowed to come in and build your factory there. And if you just look at it in terms of one's selfish appreciation of the natural world, if I'm sort of back to your point or in your point too, Father, where it's my will and I'm asserting my will, and my will is I like to have all these beautiful things around me, then it doesn't make sense. But if we see these things as bound together, the beauty of the world tells us something about the truth of the world, which tells us something about how we morally ought to respond to it, then it makes a lot more sense.
I think the Pope also brings this up when he talks about how a green, I think he says a green ideology or way of thought can go hand in hand with this inconsiderate attitude towards others and towards creation, and that, you know, just by saying that you're aware of these things isn't necessarily going to change things. And it's also interesting to me when here in the Bay Area, if you go to any store, there's so many products out there now that are basically selling you an
Right.
ecological lifestyle.
Right.
When in fact, like this one person that I've read, Owen Dell, he's an expert on sustainable landscaping, has pointed out the most ecologically friendly thing you could do is not get rid of your old car. It's to keep driving it until it falls apart,
Right.
not ditch it and buy a new electric car, or same with your appliances and things like that. It's, you know, that just becomes another form of consumerism.
Related to that, the Pope is skeptical of carbon credits.
Yes.
You know, and I like to call carbon credits the new indulgences. In other words, go ahead and sin, but this is your ticket out of
environmental
damnation
purgatory,
card. Yeah,
right.
so exactly right. And the fact that he's skeptical of this kind of thing, which just turns a so-called solution into another marketplace for a product that makes me feel good, but really doesn't actually address the underlying problem. You know, that was there's times like that when you see that he sees and that he's not just applying the glib phrases or solutions or whatever, as some might worry this encyclical is going to do. It's not doing that.
What do you think,
Go ahead, Father.
Mark and others, will be the most controversial parts of this encyclical, and to whom will it be controversial?
That's a good question. I think probably the most controversial part of the encyclical will be his treatment of climate change. And in fact, part of the discussion on my Facebook page and other places before this ever came out was the conversation about whether this is an encyclical on climate change, because that's how it was characterized. And just some of the news stories I saw the last couple of days have said this is about climate change. So I think there's going to be disagreement about that, just because there's disagreement about the subject. What does the science tell us about it? Is the science indicating that there's man-made climate change, and is it disastrous, or is this an area where there's a lot of dispute and some experts say yes, some say no? That whole conversation is going to be there, but I also think you're going to see people say, well, regardless of that, why is this in an encyclical?
Because he does come down on the side of a scientific consensus that there is global warming and it's being caused primarily by human beings.
Right.
And that is not something which can become de fide definita.
That's right.
Because there can be dispute about that, and we'll find out. Well, we won't. Our ancestors, our forebears, not our forebears, our
Descendants will
our
find
descendants
out.
will find out. I don't have any, but the thing is, as you say, whether he's right on that particular decision he made to accept that so-called consensus, what we have to do about the soil, the air, the water in our lives and our cities and our homes, that's all still true, So I would hate to see this encyclical rejected by conservatives because of the position he took on climate change.
Yeah, and as I say, if we find the magic switch tomorrow, or we find all the consensus of the scientists who are saying global warming is man-made, if they tomorrow find data and they change their mind, that doesn't make this irrelevant.
No.
Exactly.
And I think that's a point that a lot of people will miss.
I think he had to include it because there is, on an international level, this consensus, even though there are people who disagree with it, and science is an ongoing process of new information.
Open-ended.
So yeah, something could disprove tomorrow something that was believed today. I think he had to acknowledge that right now this is commonly accepted as true, and the international bodies are trying to address it. So he needs to address it. And I agree with both of you that even if it were disproved tomorrow, it does not invalidate the encyclical, because the encyclical is full of a deeper wisdom that applies to all the things we've talked about already.
Let me try to remember your question. It was, what did I think was the most controversial, apt to be most controversial?
Well, what would be the most controversial points? Not just one
Right.
single one, but what
Right.
would be controversial?
So, people have other points that they think will be controversial in this?
I think people are going to have a lot of discussion back and forth about the practical suggestions he makes, which are, he makes a lot of fairly concrete suggestions as examples of how he thinks we should move in a certain direction.
Like avoid paper and plastic.
Yeah, and so, I think that if people get caught up discussing back and forth like that, as Father said, they're going to miss the bigger point of what the encyclical is about.
And I think I put that in the context of many times he says, we need discussion on this.
Right.
It's kind of like what he did on the Synod, unfortunately, in that regard. But I mean, he does say, we need to have everybody talking together on this thing, and from different points of view. So that's good.
Yeah, and I think it's also, here in the United States, most of the really visible effects of pollution are no longer visible in the United States in the way that they were 40 years ago.
Yes.
That's right.
And so it's often easy for us to think, well, we already solved this problem.
Yeah, I don't.
And
What's he
if
talking about?
Yeah, and then you see
Right.
pictures of places in India where they have to strip down all of the industrial ships, and these parts of China where they've been mining stuff for our smartphones and dumping sludge everywhere, and the fog and everything. You're like, wait a minute, it's mostly been outsourced to other countries.
Exactly
And
right.
so, even most ecologically sensitive, quote unquote, people here in the U.S. really don't see a problem with their consumption, rapid consumption of the newest gadgets and the newest this and that. And they don't see or really care about the fact that there is a pretty big impact. It's just not here at home.
That's right. I was going to say, as far as controversial aspects, that some people might take exception to this sort of hyperbolic language, like it's a disaster and it's the
Right.
worst that's ever been, and this kind of thing. And you're absolutely right, John, that from an American perspective, where we have a Clean Water Act, we have a Clean Air Act, we have catalytic converters on our cars, we've outsourced all of our heavy industry and heavy mining. And so for us,
We
it's-
recycle.
and some places
Some
we
places,
do.
right.
And so for us, we do, I think, well, what's the Chicken Little attitude
Syndrome,
coming
right.
from? I mean, I don't understand. But go to India, go to China, go to Argentina, go to South America, go to these countries where private companies have bought all the water because they're going to put in some kind of factory or process and they need water supplies. And now the local people can't dig a well anymore and drink water. I mean, we have laws in this country that protect against these things, but the multinational interests have moved into places where there are no such laws to protect the environment, to protect the local people, and so on. And so we're at a distance from the havoc that's being caused by this basically rampant consumerism.
And because he says we're part of the cause of it, as you said, by outsourcing these things, we also have some responsibility. He talks about the ecological debt, I think he calls it.
Yes, the ecological debt.
But he does kind of lean in one direction only there, because he talks about our taking resources from people, but the point is we're also providing jobs for people, and they're selling us their resources, and they can raise the price if they want to, So there's a good we do by helping people develop their own minds and factories and so on, but at the very same time, we have to help them try and do it in a way that environmentally friendly, but not prevent their development, because now that we've developed ourselves, we say, we're clean, you guys have to be clean too. No, wait a minute, we have to help you grow. But he mentioned several times here about the environmental costs. We don't calculate in our economic calculations that we have some responsibility to the rest of the world for the fact that we consume and therefore have waste, and therefore we have to do something about what we do in the environment. Yeah.
That's the other thing we're doing. We're outsourcing our waste.
Yeah. And he does mention, I believe, near in the encyclical that we cannot outsource our guilt by trying to do what you were describing, imposing these standards on developing countries in a way that prevents them from actually developing a thriving economy.
Now, one point of controversy, I think, too, he says in there that, he quotes him, I think, that the last 200 years have been the most devastating for the environment, in the whole history of mankind. And that's because of the great progress due to fossil fuels. I mean, if it weren't for fossil fuels, we wouldn't have had that development and that waste and that other pollution. But the fact is, he kind of minimizes the fact that the world standard of living for everybody has gone way up, and for millions and millions of people who otherwise would have starved, so that there will be, I think, some pushback on that.
Right. Although he does have a section where he talks about technological advances, and especially in the area of medicine, how that's been able to help. There's a section where he talks about the beauty of an airplane.
Right.
That sort of thing.
In a skyscraper.
In a skyscraper.
Yeah.
So it's the kind of thing you don't usually see in papal encyclicals, so I found that interesting. Father, you gave us 2 summary paragraphs, and I wanted to ask if you or anybody else has a passage or a text that you want to quote or you want to talk about, you found especially insightful or problematic, as the case may be.
Well, I did mine.
It's okay if you didn't.
Well, I wrote most of mine down as notes as to sections. So,
well, then I why don't I do?
I have a favorite one.
All right, very good.
We are not God.
Oh, well said.
Yeah.
It's interesting that he says that, and there's a kind of balancing act that he wants to do here. He wants to balance between the idea that we should value creation, and therefore there is a kind of there's a limit to what we can do. And he makes the point, creation is not divine. We're not worshiping the created order. And it puts limits, because it's a gift from God, puts limits on what we can do. And on the other hand, he does acknowledge that human beings, man has a preeminence in the world. So it's not like we're just one more species among all the various species out there, and there's no special significance to human beings. So we're not God. I think that was very well said there, Vivian.
And connecting to what you said too is that therefore we can't have unlimited progress.
Oh, yes.
That we have to receive creation as a gift, recognize the connection between generations. That's another kind of holistic element in this thing, and that we have to provide for those who come after us by limiting our means of production and consumption, our ways of production and consumption, in such a way that we can be more sustainable.
You mean technology isn't going to solve everything for us, Father? I mean, endless progress possible here.
We should have Eve on this conversation, because she thinks it will, but I know I don't.
well, the one part that struck me that about this is the emphasis on the relationship, and that's something that you see in von Balthasar and with Ratzinger
too, yeah.
a lot. So this passage here, disregard.
What paragraph is that?
This is paragraph 70. It's middle of the way through. He says, disregard for the duty to cultivate and maintain a proper relationship with my neighbor, for whose care and custody I am responsible, ruins my relationship with my own self, with others, with God, and with the earth. And it's almost like a paraphrase of something that Pope Benedict said, which is that he said that to be truly human means to be related in love, to be from and for. Sin, on the other hand, means the deranging or destruction of that relationship. When I destroy the relationship, then this event, sin, affects the other members of the relationship as well, the whole relationship. That's why sin is always an offense that involves other persons, that changes and damages the world, which ties it all back into the fact that we do live in a fallen creation, and that there is always that element that is damaging our relationship with each other's, and our life should always be about trying to repair those relationships.
Yeah, we're back in Genesis 3. Man sins, damages his relationship with God, damages his relationship with himself. He becomes subject to death, damages his relationship, man and woman, their relationship is damaged. And then the curse on the order of creation damages his relationship with the environment. So that fourfold alienation, which is traditional, it's not like this is some kind of new thing, expresses well the sort of theological and moral agenda of this document.
What was new for me with this treatment of Genesis is when the Pope points out that after Cain murdered his brother, that the earth cried out with his blood. And he makes that connection between this crime I've committed toward another human being has now affected everything. And I just never saw that before.
Yeah, it's also interesting that he points out that as when God, Jesus rose from the dead, he now has created a path for all creation to be redeemed. And that it is us working through Christ and with Christ that can be working towards this.
That was one thing, he did say that, but overall, there's kind of a lack of a sense of eternity in this encyclical. We have not here a lasting city. Our home here is not lasting. So, it's not, he's got a spirituality there, but it's kind of a homey spirituality of this life. And it doesn't spend too much on asceticism in here, on voluntarily giving up good things for the sake of a higher spiritual good. So that's that's not so much a criticism of what's in it, but just to say this isn't everything in here. It's about a specific problem he's addressing, and I do think, not really controversy, but a question comes about, well, why is the Catholic Church talking about this now? I mean, everybody else talking about it. You guys coming late to the party, aren't you?
Right, that's a good question.
But I think the answer to that is the Catholic Church takes the spoils of Egypt. That is, it sees the good things that are out there, but it purifies them. It looks at them. He's looking at the whole environmental movement, the green movement, and technology and progress. And he said, let's step back now and see what's good in this, but also what needs correction or what needs some a spiritual principle to help direct it. And so that's the Catholic thing, it seems to me, in this, is that he talks about integral ecology, trying to bring together all these things which are floating around in the ambient culture, as you will, as it were, and trying to make a consistent Catholic integrated picture out of them.
Yeah, so I have everything there that should be, nothing there that shouldn't be, and everything that's there is in right relationship.
Exactly.
Yeah, very good. Do you want to add something, Vivian? You look like you wanted to weigh in there. I don't know if anybody else has any other particular passages or topics.
The one last part that I liked is the section on joy and peace.
Yes.
And this is where he really kind of addresses the idea that we need to live with sobriety, with our mind upon the next life, and that he gives kind of a little homey aside there that one expression of this attitude is we need to stop and give thanks to God before and after meals.
Yes.
As a moment of blessing. But he also mentions our developing an appreciation for true beauty and for culture as being important aspects of this, the joy and the peace that can lead us towards this. So I think that's also important aspect.
So basically, we want you to all go out and buy this encyclical. Ignatius Press is selling it.
That's right.
It'll be available in the middle of August.
This is crass
2015.
consumerism.
It is.
Consumerism. You can repent of it later, Father. Very good.
Buy our books, help the environment.
That's right. Well, although this is tooting our own horn, but we are publishing a high-quality edition of this, and a very beautiful edition. And it gets to your point about the value of having a beautiful thing, and the idea that conveys. You know, I'm not saying there's something wrong with, you know, the quick paperback editions of these things, but there is something to be said for taking the time to create a book as a work of art.
But we will use recycled paper on this one.
That's right, very good. Well, thank you, Father Fessio, Vivian Dudro, John Harriet, for this great discussion. The discussion here is ending, but it's going to just begin in the larger world. So thanks very
Amen.
much.
Thank you,
Thank
Mark.
you.